So thank you for that introduction. I want to thank you, Sarah, and Leo as well, for this incredible event, an event that was a long time in the making, and I think really breaks an incredible new ground in Hopper scholarship. I also want to thank you, the audience, for being here. It's not often that I lecture to hundreds that aren't compelled in some way by a grade to be there. It gives me pause, I think, because it lets me think about the way in which great works of art compel us to want to look and understand. So with that, I'll begin. In May, Edward Hopper and his wife, Josephine Niven Hopper, or Jo, set out on the road to Mexico, journeying southward in their 1939 Buick, the Trio, and here I name the car, perhaps in contradiction or contradistinction to Maggie, as a virtual member of the family, traversed over 2,000 miles to reach their destination, Saltillo, Mexico. Staying there 6 weeks in local hotels, they toured in the car and sketched their Mexican surround. But Edward grew weary of the weather and the food and frequently voiced anxiety over the summer gas shortage and the challenge of maintaining their automobile. Crossing back into the United States on July 2nd, Jo playfully noted in her diary, and I quote, that both Edward and the Buick regained their customary cheer. Customary cheer, apparently. They then drove north across New Mexico and Colorado, where Edward pulled the car to the side of the road and climbed into the Buick's back seat, his preferred painting position within the car, while Jo sketched from her more customary passenger side perch. The result is a rather unique image, an automobile-based landscape, or perhaps an interior, or perhaps a portrait, perhaps, as I'll argue eventually, a self-portrait entitled Jo in Wyoming. Now, in the context of Hopper's career, and especially his long-standing interest in U.S. travel and tourism culture, significant things, I think, crystallize within this painting. By 1946, the road trip was already a well-paved rite, perhaps we should say route of passage for the American public. The Hoppers, along with countless others, were dedicated auto tourists and lodgers. They shared in the promise of freedom and self-determination mythologized within, and perhaps sometimes even realized upon, the open road. Yet, as auto tourism became a regularized industry, offering often pre-packaged experiences, from scenic routes and roadside attractions to airtight auto cabins and standardized hotel rooms, motorists grappled with the illusory nature of that promise. Jo's diary divulges just such a mixed sensibility, revealing their 1946 road trip as an odd amalgam of revelation and monotony, movement and stasis, connection and disassociation, empowerment and regulation, expansion and encapsulation. Edward's car, road, and motel paintings convey the same feeling, or at least I think they do. In doing so, they underscore a compellingly self-contradictory sense of automotive consciousness, one shaped by the yearnings for freedom and boundlessness, but experienced from within conditions of steady enclosure, the car cabin, the motel room, the prepackaged tourist landscape. Now, many of us here will agree that Hopper's art is in fundamental ways about being inside, enclosed, and introspective. That's its power for us. That's its attraction. Pictures of solitary buildings, introspective figures, and even socially detached groups all highlight isolation, containment, and interiority as an underlying, perhaps even irreducible condition of Hopper's art and being. Until now, too little attention has been given to the broad systems of automobility, roads, cars, lodgings, filling stations, garages, attractions, and the social structures that they enact as the consequential means of Hopper's interiority. But as the VMFA's wonderful exhibition makes clear, the experience of modern travel, and indeed transience, I think ensnarled Hopper. Something like the 60 freeway back home in California. To better understand how this is the case requires thinking about cars and hotels as more than just subject matter, even though many of the artist's works included them as such. It also necessitates moving beyond the car's direct function as a tool for vision, a means through which Hopper saw the world, scouting, sketching, and framing his views. Rather, we must understand the automobile and automobile travel as a state of being, an all-over experience in which motorists' personal and social selves came to be composed from within the tightly defined spaces of the automotive system. Now, especially, I think, we need to consider the contradictions of a seemingly expansive but actually enclosed and interiorizing sensation, a sensation offered by cars, car cabins, motels, and inns. These were the things that travelers occupied. These were the things that Hopper painted. Now, Joe in Wyoming might seem like an unusual painting to open an analysis of Hopper's well-known hotel and motel works. Yet this picture, an automobile interior and its surrounding landscape, rewards close study. The first payoff comes in our recognition of what the view is not. It's not a conventional landscape. Since the European Renaissance, the tradition of landscape has been defined, or at least it was up until the early 20th century, by a nearly unlimited sense of accessibility, wherein the world was revealed via the projective potency of the human gaze. And this is a scene from Alberti's famous De Pictura. In American philosophy, this promiscuous now I'll call it, perspicacity, was sanctified by the transcendentalist writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in 1836 idealized the encounter with nature as one where, and I quote Emerson, who can't, standing on bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite spaces, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. Now, 2 generations at least of American painters embraced this conceit of the expansive exteriority of landscape experience, crafting images of the world framelessly unfolding before the eyes of omnipotent traveler viewers. That something stood between viewers and their experiences was generally not considered. Indeed, conveyances were most often naturalized into landscapes. They were transformational in their own way and in important ways, but also held apart from those who were doing the looking and indeed the traveling. A similar thing happened in the representation of inns, which were usually offered up as objects within a landscape rather than as enclosures in which traveler viewers stayed and from which they saw the world directly. This is not surprising, perhaps, as focusing on interiors of travel would draw attention away from exterior spaces, from Emerson's omnipotent and expansive individualism. Even the century's most celebrated, the 19th century's most celebrated hotel painting constitutes, and here we have Woodville's famous War News from Mexico. The inn, of course, is the American hotel. Constitutes the inn not as an enclosure, but rather as a stage with the social drama essentially of country making taking place on an exterior porch. Now, the point of this quick survey of 19th century landscapes is to demonstrate that before Hopper, the focus of travel imagery was usually on the exterior, the traveler in the outside world. Little attention was granted to the enclosures that enabled those experiences, be they vehicles or inns. Hopper was not immune. In his early commercial work for Hotel Management and other magazines, he consistently cast hotels and automobiles as backdrops rather than in habitation, outsides rather than insides. Yet simultaneously, other of his early travel-related works began to do something different. They began to look inside. The combination of enclosure and motion seems to have been the key, as in a number of early railway etchings from around 1920, in which Hopper shifts his view from the outside, which we see on the left, into the cabin. This is a viewpoint that Hopper retained throughout his career. But to what end? I believe that Hopper was working his way towards an understanding that modern human experiences were increasingly and inevitably not exterior to, but rather enclosed within the machinery of modern transport, perhaps even the machinery of modern life. To foreshadow, I think the same shift can be seen in his representations of architecture, which increasingly began to interiorize. Through such works, and views of lodgings especially, Hopper approached doorways and peered into windows, inhabiting interior spaces. Whoops, sorry. So he's doing this in order. He approached windows, he inhabited interior spaces before finally looking back out. But what about the automobile, and more specifically, Joe in Wyoming? As the emergent and soon dominant mode of travel of his era, not to mention, I think, the diaries show a personal infatuation, cars are at least oblique concerns in numerous Hopper works. Views from and of the road, images of roadway landscapes, gas pumps, travelers, and parked cars at hotels. Joe in Wyoming, however, is something different. It is an intertwining of travel and interior that is direct, emphatic, and encapsulating. The modest size, horizontally oriented watercolor simultaneously encompasses and is framed by the interior of the couple's Buick. At right center is Joe in the act of painting, with brush in hand extended to the surface before her. A brown jacket folds over the seat to the left and overlaps the steering wheel. The driver's seat is empty. Surrounding the steering column and Joe, Hopper painted a horizontal band of windows, a kind of, you could say, fishbowl. The auto glass, the passenger door is ajar, creating a small curved trapezoid of open air, which is the only portion of the cabin that actually accesses the exterior. The auto glass appears almost unbelievably transparent, however, and without dirt or glare that might muddle the view or the landscape beyond it. The rearview mirror is cloudier, however, yet undeniably conveys the reflection of a human head and neck on its left-hand side. This is presumably Edward in the back seat. And for those of us who have spent so long looking for Edward in his own landscapes, I want to say, there he is. So, the precision of Joe in Wyoming suggests that Hopper was leaving little to chance. The brushstrokes are measured, the organization exacting, and the elements purposeful. Hopper's oils and watercolors often have their share of carefully observed and meticulously rendered detail. Even so, Joe in Wyoming exhibits a more than ordinary attention to the layout of the various cabin elements. Indeed, it is instructive to compare the watercolor to a Buick advertisement from 1939 showcasing the interior of a car very much like the one owned by the Hoppers in 1946. Joe's diary suggests that Edward's accuracy does in fact derive from his obsession, but an obsession not with representational accuracy, but rather automobiling. She writes in detail of Edward's relationship to the Buick, and also to their Dodges, of which in combination there were several, emphasizing his attentiveness to the car's roadworthiness, as well as his attentiveness to the placement of things within it. Throughout Joe's entries, Edward's concern for the car takes the cast of the sort of tenor and the feel of the sort of feelings that one might have for a human being, a friend. Now, Hopper's fixation extended beyond the auto itself to include what we might also understand as its social environment, that being its occupancy by the couple and their belongings. To quote Joe, "This car contains 1 million things, and I'm so conscious of the rights and values of each one of them. The ensemble constitutes a mosaic, and if any part of it is made to fit, they won't all get in." So Joe understands the implication of this, what she calls a mosaic, to be both spatial and social, involving the arrangement of items in the trunk, as well as the all-too-human negotiations over what things even warranted bringing. Indeed, with regard to the latter, Joe recounted in her diary how an argument over packing led Edward to physically assault her, while she defended herself by biting his arm and drawing blood. Relationships, social relationships, car relationships, all too human. For the Hoppers, the car interior was significant, a literal and figurative encapsulation of their individual and social beings. Especially as contextualized by Joe's diary, Hopper's view from the car becomes a repository of compositional and personal makeup, everything shaped by the cabin itself. In something of a departure, the watercolor portrays Joe not as the mostly anonymous model she so often was in so many Hopper's paintings. Instead, she is particularized in the sharpness of her jaw, the agedness implied by the slack skin around her neck and upper arm, her loosely arranged graying hair, and the insouciant combination of yellow striped shirt and blue overall straps. Her placement on the passenger side with a slight but insuperable distance between her shoulder and the gear shift, this consequential inch, let's say right here, testifies perhaps to the couple's lifelong struggle over Joe's right to drive. Now, Edward's positioning is equally significant. Other than his self-portraits, Joe in Wyoming is one of the very few paintings in which Edward directly signals and in the mirror, in fact, renders his own presence. The angles of the view fix Hopper in the center of the back seat and by extension of the picture space. He was the de facto master of the interior. Significantly, Hopper's reflection on the left side of the mirror also aligns him with the vacant driver's station, so here to here. The brown jacket draped over the seat back, this one here, is assuredly Edward's, especially given the artist's decision to place his signature along its lower edge. This ownership, I think, is important, as the jacket is Hopper's surrogate behind the wheel. Now, in a car-mad mid-century America, to identify oneself as a driver was no small thing. So, too often, car experience is perceived as an exteriorizing experience, where the passenger moves into and through terrain. Therefore, Hopper's shift of focus in Joe in Wyoming, his turning of the painting inwards towards the cabin, is noteworthy. Many of the era's through the windshield views tended to concentrate on the outward gaze to the point of effacing the car's frame. This is the case in other of Edward's own Wyoming watercolors. Both of these here presumably painted from the same back seat, but neither of which includes explicitly the frame of the car. Yet in Joe in Wyoming, the artist insisted upon the interior aspects of the car and by extension, auto travel. For all its windows and even the open passenger door, the painting's energy is circular and enclosed. So circular and closed in. Note how these circles sort of reverberate within. The small but prominent rearview mirror affirms this by diverting attention from the landscape and back into the car cabin itself. Thus, as we look forward into the landscape, the rearview mirror reminds us to look back, to think about the space we're in. Now, hotels and cars are, of course, distinct in many ways, yet they share a common purpose of enabling and serving travelers. As the car became the primary mode of transport and tourism in the United States, however, hotels, and eventually motels, motor lodges, inns, and camper parks, adapted to complement auto travel. I believe Hopper grappled with this new sense of mobility, not just of cars, but of buildings. His celebrated painting, House by the Railroad, is one example of the artist's efforts to represent an architecture defined by motion. Here, Hopper makes the house appear to sit directly on the foreground railroad tracks, as if a nudge from a locomotive might send it, along with its inhabitants, or should we now say passengers, down the line. There are other instances where Hopper recognized that the effects of mobility were not just exterior, but penetrated walls and windows to recompose the form and meaning of interior spaces. In this vein, the otherwise unassuming 1945 painting and drawings of a small tourist home, Room for Tourists, offers a rather sophisticated mediation or meditation on how, in a modern world, distinctions between architecture, enclosure, which we might understand as enclosure and stability, and transportation, which we might understand as expansion and fluidity, how these differences become blurry. In preparation for the final work, Hopper sketched the house repeatedly from his car, again from the back seat. As a result, the finished work, I think, is not merely an exterior view of a lodging house. It is instead a negotiation across and through multiple spaces, as its line of sight travels from the car interior, from the back seat, across the street here, to the exterior of the house, and finally through the windows, and thus into a second interior. That Hopper wanted viewers to imagine looking inside the house is evident in his attention to the windows. Some are lighted, some are dark, inviting us to consider the possibilities of occupancy. Of course, the idea of visual passage is nothing new in art. Remarkable in Room for Tourists, especially in relation to Joe in Wyoming, is the extent to which its visual movement simultaneously implies and derives from a specifically automotive-based sensibility. This is clearly the case for Hopper in these two works, where both his literal and implied occupancy of the vehicle divulge how much his ability to paint is reliant upon the car, reliant both inside and out. The car got him there, but it also provides him a studio in the form of a back seat. It also finally provides him a cultural environment, a cultural prompt. But is this not equally the case for the lodging across the street, whose occupants, no less than Hopper, are encapsulated within chambers whose form and intent accommodate a culture of travel? Like Hopper, the tourist home tenants will soon enough return to their driver's seats, start engines, and move on. As both an artist driver and an artist lodger, Hopper must have aligned his own position in the car cabin with that of the tourists in their equally transient chambers across the street. Now, it is tempting to interpret Hopper's transience as diffident, alienated, or melancholic. His hotel images are particularly subject to such an approach. Take, for example, one scholar's characterization of the pervasive loneliness or the inability to interact with other people, conveyed by Hopper's 1931 painting, Hotel Room, or the, quote, non-communication and poignant lack of emotional interaction another author ascribes to the 1943 painting, Hotel Lobby. These are, of course, strong readings, but they are not the only options. Is it not also possible that amidst the hustle and flow of modern life, the stillness and isolation seen in Hotel Room is something more of a respite, a chance to pull off to the shoulder, as in Joe in Wyoming, and look into things before re-engaging in the journey? Hopper suggests that learning to inhabit transience, I think, is a necessary response to modern mobility. Hotel Lobby goes even further by providing what can now be understood as a map for navigating an architecture of movement. In the exhibition volume, Leo Mazo, of course, asserts that the broad green stripe in the painting and its study drawings, this broad green stripe of carpet here, resonates in form and purpose with a road in that it establishes a route of passage. In doing so, it defines the lobby in terms of its mobility. It defines the lobby in terms of its ability to move people through it. Yet also like a roadway, or perhaps a car cabin, the lobby also provides rest areas, services, comforts and accommodations, overstuffed chairs, a registration counter, a dining room, and finally, out of sight, hotel rooms themselves. Hotel Lobby shows people steering into these spaces, a book, a chair, like car cabin occupants who are, paradoxically, always at rest within a moving object. To the extent that the landscape painting on the canvas is left, to the extent that that painting implies exteriority, it is significant that no one is looking at it. Now, Hopper's latest and perhaps signature work in the lodging genre, Western Motel, is the only one that comes close to foregrounding the car as much as Joe in Wyoming. The images have similarities. The context for Western Motel is another of Hopper's extended road trips. The setting is another purposefully mobilized chamber, the burgeoning motel industry's equivalent of the car cabin. The compositions share several key attributes: a car, a roadside landscape seen from a window, and a gaze, this time from a woman, rather than from Hopper in the rearview mirror, that directs attention back into the room, thus completing, like the rearview mirror, a sense of interiority. Now, Joe here was certainly the female model. Western Motel, like the Wyoming watercolor, signals the presence of Edward as well. In the lower right, a blue article of clothing here, occupies a lounge chair with the artist's signature, you can't see it in my slide, but with the artist's signature again immediately adjacent. Again, a labeled coat. I think this notion of signature is important, especially given the inclusion here of tags on the luggage, which make us think of the nominating, naming, claiming feature. In the left corner, a bulky suitcase, or bulky suitcases, also insinuate Edward's occupancy. He was the one, we know from the diaries, that usually carried the baggage, and puts him in his corresponding place, corresponding to the female, on the other side of the bed. In Wyoming, Hopper's construction of the view made him into a driver. In Western Motel, he makes himself into a motel lodger. And I'll conclude by saying that in each instance, he is defined by the condition of modern travel, that of unmoving bodies cocooned inside cabins that are themselves on the go. Thank you.